I love this crowd, and I love all the hats that you're wearing for our speaker today. Before I introduce our hat expert, I'd just like to acknowledge and thank Sydney Marchand, who's here from Charter Senior Living in Dedham, who sponsored the cookies today. Thank you, Sydney. And she brought, there's some handouts and brochures out there too, if you're interested. So thank you again. Very happy to welcome Lori Pires, who's here to talk about the history of hats. And look at all the hats she brought. Thank you, Lori.
Thank you, Debbie. I'd like to thank Debbie and everybody here for having me, and all of you for attending. This is a great turnout. Are you sure she didn't promise you like ice cream sundaes later? That's what I was wondering. But anyways, we're going to talk, or I'm going to talk, hopefully you're going to enjoy it, about some history with hats, how I started collecting them, and some of the stories, which I think some of them are kind of funny, of how I acquired a few of them. So I started collecting them when I was 11 years old, and I read a book about a boy that always wore a different hat. And it's amazing how many books are out there, children's books. This was just a 3-day hat, and then Dr. Seuss, 500 hats. I probably have 15 different children's books, all related to hats and headwear. So I read a book about a boy that always wore a different hat, and I thought that was rather interesting. So my parents took us to Disney and bought me a pair of Mickey Mouse ears. I do still have these at home, but I decided then at 11 years old that this was going to be the first hat in my collection. Now, well over 50 years later, I have over 500 pieces of headwear. Of course, I couldn't bring them all today, but I brought a sampling of them. Hats have been around for a very long time. They found a drawing on a cave wall in Thebes, Egypt, that dates back to 3100 BC, and it depicted a man wearing a conical-shaped hat. And then in 1991, if anybody remembers the discovery of Otzi the Iceman, Otzi was found thawing in the Swiss and Italian Alps along the border. He was found by some German tourists, and he is the most intact mummy found encased in ice. I mention him because he dates back to between 3100 and 3400 BC, and Otzi was found wearing a bearskin hat. So again, they've been around for a very long time. First, to protect us from the elements, the wind, the rain, the snow. Over time, they've come to represent fashion, fun. When my kids were growing up, this was always their favorite hat because it did this. Of course, in addition to having fun with hats, they also represent the military. We have police, pilots' hats, even the drivers of the beer trucks wore this is a Schlitz hat. Do you remember when nurses wore these? Or when McDonald's workers wore these? I do like to point out the fire helmet. This is an old leather fire helmet. Now, although the materials have changed over the years, the design has remained the same with the elongated back. These men and women are out doing a very difficult job. That back was specifically designed to help keep the elements off the back of their necks. Now, I delivered a mail route, walked a mail route for 27 years. Of course, the government gives us something like this. Not a lot of protection out in the elements. In fact, a lot of the cold, rainy days, I wish we had one of these. So before I get into some of the history, I'd love to share the story of how I got my French mail hat. My daughter and I were vacationing in France years ago, and I had brought with me a United States hat, hoping to trade it for a French mail hat. we went into a first post office, and I told the clerk how I'd like to meet a mail carrier. Was there one in the building? She said, nope, they don't work in this building. And I told her I was hoping to get a French mail hat. She said, that's impossible. It's in the rules, it's in their manual. They're not allowed to sell or transfer any part of their uniform. Okay, a few days later, we went to a different post office, basically the same scenario. They told me it's in the manual. He is not allowed to sell any part of his uniform. Well, the very last day of the trip, my eagle-eyed daughter sees a French mail carrier coming down the hill. And she says, Mom, but he's not wearing a hat. I said, oh, I can see it. It's in his little cart. So we went up to him, and I can speak a little bit of French. I said, bonjour, je suis un facteur États-Unis, which is, hi, I'm a mail carrier in the United States. Well, I think he thought I was his long-lost sister. He hugged me, gave me a kiss on each cheek. I then told him how I collected hats. I would love his hat for my collection. And lucky for me, he did not read the manual. He just reached in and handed me his hat. So because he did that and he was so nice about it, I still handed him the United States of America hat. Well, 2 more times during the day, my daughter and I are walking around, and there's this French mailman in full uniform, United States of America on his hat. So that's one of the reasons I still collect hats. It's a lot of fun, and there's different stories involved. The other reason is the history. If I didn't like history, I think my father would have disowned me, because that was his thing. So we're going to start with what I consider iconic hats. They've been around for hundreds of years, and they're still around today. The first one would be the scally cap newsboy style. This type of hat dates back to the 1300s. Now, in 1571, Parliament passed a law that every male over the age of 6 had to wear a woolen hat on Sundays and holidays, or they'd face a fine. The only reason for that was to promote the wool trade. So the men, of course, did this, and after about 25 years, Parliament did repeal that law. But it was a sense of camaraderie, so they continued to wear this style hat. Now, when the Irish immigrants came to America, they brought this style with them. A lot of the Irish immigrants worked along the shipyards and the docks, and they started getting a bad reputation as gamblers and fighters and drinkers, and people began referring to them as scallywags. Well, scallywags wore scally hats, and that's the name we still have today. The second hat I like to talk about is one of my favorites, is the top hat. In 1793, there was a gentleman by the last name of Dunnage, and he designed a top hat style hat. He was a hatter. Hatters make men's hats, and milliners make women's hats. So you can be a man and make a woman's hat, you're a milliner. And of course, some make both. Trying to get this. Can you hold my microphone?
Sure.
Thank you. You didn't know you were going to be put to work, did you? So the top hat, again, that was 1793, but not much came about from it. But in 1797, a hatter by the name of John Hetherington designed this style of hat, and he wore it out of his shop in England down the main streets of London. The story says he caused such a commotion, he was stopped by the police and fined for disturbing the peace. Now, there was a gentleman for the New York Times that witnessed this whole event. He wrote it up on the front page of the paper, including a picture of this hat, this style hat. The rest, as they say, was history. Anybody that was anybody now wanted a top hat. It was made initially with beaver fur, so it was a very expensive item. So it was predominantly for the middle to upper class. If we think in the United States, does anybody in particular come to mind of wearing a top hat? Very good. I like this audience. Yes, Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, wore the tallest of the 3 styles. It was called a stovepipe. And he was a lawyer by trade. He would put his important papers up inside his top hat. Now, in 1865, when Lincoln was assassinated, the War Department took possession of a lot of his belongings. And with his wife Mary's permission, it took about 2 years, but they donated the hat to the Smithsonian. The curator there thought it was still too soon and too fresh in people's minds with the assassination. He literally put it in a basement closet for about 25 years. Eventually, it was lent out to an exhibit they were doing about President Lincoln, and when it was returned, it was put on permanent display, which is where it is today. In addition to President Lincoln, every U.S. president up until Kennedy, excluding Eisenhower before him, wore a top hat to the presidential inauguration. On September 2nd, 1945, the Japanese boarded the USS Missouri in order to sign surrender papers after World War II. Every non-military member of the Japanese delegation wore a top hat. And if you think of the fun people, there's the rich uncle from Monopoly wears a top hat. Uncle Sam wears a top hat. And of course, you can't talk about them without talking about the Mad Hatter. Now, the numbers on the side, 10/6, refer to the supposed price, 10 shillings and 6 pence. Now, a few years ago, my daughter, who has come to several of these talks with me, came home, she was very excited. She had been to a trivia night. And she said, "Mom, the question was, what were the numbers on the side of the Mad Hatter's hat, and what did they mean?" So she was all excited. She won the bonus question. I was all excited. She actually listens to me when I talk. So 1814 would have been the first time, I'm going to need someone to hold my microphone. Thank you. It would have been the first time that you had somebody hold up a hat, a magician, and say, "Watch me pull a rabbit out of my hat." That was Louis Comte. He was a theater owner and a famous magician in England. He performed for the king. So he was credited with one of the first people as using that on stage. Another example. This in 1840. It looks like a regular top hat. I've torn the insides so you could get a better look. But this is a collapsible top hat. In 1840, Antoine Gibbes decided to modify the top hat because one of the problems with it, of course, was going out to theater or to the show, and it was obviously too much to wear on top of the head. You'd block people's views. So he put springs inside. So you could drop it down, and this is in the mid-1800s, again, 1840, but you could now drop it down. It was known as a gibbous or simply an opera hat. And some of the theaters in England would even put special brackets under their seats so you could slide this into the bracket. I brought two 1800s leather hat cases. This one holds the top hat. But just to show you what people went through to protect their headwear. Now, in 1849, there was a wealthy landowner, also in England, and his last name was C-O-K-E, but he pronounced it Cook. Mr. Cook employed quite a few riders on his property, mend the fences and take care of the livestock, but he wanted them to dress appropriately, and that for him included a top hat. Well, the top hat was not the most conducive hat for riding a horse. It was knocked off by the branches, trampled by the horses. So he went to the oldest hat company in the world, which is still in existence today. It's Lock & Company, and they are on St. James Street in England. And he asked them to make him a special hat with a shorter crown, sturdier on top. And we have somebody wearing one in the corner. It's called a bowler. The bowler, the gentleman that created this for Lock & Company were a couple of brothers, and their last name was bowler. It's also referred to, of course, as a derby. That really started in the United States when there was, actually in the 1800s, when they started the Churchill Downs, when they started the Kentucky Derby, which they just had the 151st running. The grandson from Lewis and Clark expedition, the grandson, Meriwether Lewis Clark, it's kind of confusing with his name, but he is the one that started the Kentucky Derby at Churchill Downs. He borrowed the money from his two uncles whose last name were Churchill and created Churchill Downs, which of course is a big event for headwear for women. And at the time, you would see literally seas of derbies. And this is a really cool box as well. And if you just think of a few people in history that wore derbies, this was actually considered the hat that won the West, because cowboy hat wasn't invented till 1865 by John Stetson. So the derby was considered the hat that won the West. And if you look back at some of the old Westerns on TV, notice the butchers, the shopkeepers, the bankers, they wore bowlers or derbies. And Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of England, wore a derby. The bad guys, Butch Cassidy. The good guys, Bat Masterson. That was a very popular hat for the times and seems to still be popular today. One of my favorite stories regarding the derby, it's a small picture. You're welcome to come up and look at it later. But it shows a picture. This is from today. But in the 1920s, there were shipments of bowlers or derbies sent to Bolivia. And they were sent to Bolivia for a group of British railroad workers there. Now, when they arrived, none of the derbies fit. They were all too small. So what do you do with boxes and boxes of derbies in Bolivia? You tell the Quechuan women of the area that this is high fashion in England. So seriously, it worked. And again, I showed you this. This is a picture from nowadays, and the Quechuan women in their beautiful dresses and skirts, and they're wearing the bowlers on their head. So that's a lot of men's style hats. What were the women wearing? Not quite as exciting at first, predominantly bonnets. They date back to the 1300s as well, and even further back. But women predominantly wore the bonnet. They might have been different materials or different colors, but it was a bonnet. But there was another style of bonnet in the late 1700s. This is the oldest piece in my collection. It's from 1790. It's called a calash, which is a type of bonnet. But the women then had the tall wigs, so they needed a style of bonnet that would correlate with their wig. So the calash would open up. They would put either wood or whalebone in it so that it would open and fit on the woman's wigs. Again, this is my oldest piece, as you can see. When I did a talk a few years ago for Historic New England, it was at the Eustis Estate. So in return, they toured me at their facility in Haverhill, Mass. And it was amazing. It was so much history. It was artwork and clothing and hats. And the curator was telling me, we were walking through the furniture section, and she was telling me a funny story that a year prior, they had an appraiser come in that was supposed to be appraising something for them. And on the way to whatever department they were heading to, they walked through the furniture area. And the woman asked why a particular item was in with the furniture. And the curator said, well, it's the hood of a baby carriage, but they didn't donate the carriage. And the appraiser laughed and said, no, that's a calash. It was that large in size, and it looked like a baby carriage. So they were able to finally move it to the right area. When sometimes you go out at night and you say, let's have a nightcap, that directly derives from a time when we had no heat in the homes. Men and women would wear these little bonnets to bed to warm up at night, and they were called nightcaps. So that's where the term today comes from. In addition to bonnets, men and women were also wearing straw hats. This one dates back over 100 years. This hat was actually given to me by one of my postal customers, sorry. And again, it's well over 100 years old. It's from Foxborough, Massachusetts. I see a lot of heads nodding. At one point in time, Foxborough, Massachusetts was considered the straw hat capital of the world. Not just New England, the world. They attribute that to a young 12-year-old girl named Betsy Metcalf. Betsy lived in Rhode Island, and she saw a straw bonnet in a store window. Of course, 12 years old, she couldn't afford it, but she fell in love with it. She taught herself to braid hats, straw bonnets, with the straw that she got from her father's field, until she finally made one that she thought was appropriate, and she wore it to her school in Rentham, Mass. A lot of her classmates were from different areas, of course, and there were quite a few that came from Foxborough. So they asked her to teach them how to do this. Betsy taught them all how to make these straw hats, and over time, remember, this is when women didn't have money of their own, they didn't own property, but here were these young girls making these hats, and there was a gentleman by the last name of Carpenter. He was buying the hats from them, taking them into Boston, and selling out on a daily basis. So a little cottage industry sprung up, and not just the young girls, but the moms, they were all making this type of a hat. Then that was in 1798. And then in 1809, there was a woman named Mary Kice. Mary lived in Connecticut, and she started braiding straw with silk to make hats as well. Mary Kice then sent to the government, she wanted to patent her idea. Now, nowhere did it say women couldn't hold a patent. They couldn't have their own money, they couldn't own property, but there was nothing that said they couldn't have a patent. So she was granted the very first patent to a woman in the United States. So it had to do with making hats with straw and silk. She actually got a letter from Dolly Parton, sorry guys. Wrong era. She got a letter from President Madison's wife, and she thanked her for bringing the technology with women to the forefront of industry with her idea. Now, in the late 1800s also, let's see, 1798, you like this one? In the late 1800s, there were a couple of cousins. Their last names were Hall and Hemingway. This is actually in 1896. It takes a minute sometimes for the dates to come back in my head. So 1896, these two cousins started reading about the bird populations in America, how they were being decimated for millinery purposes. It wasn't just in America, it was in Europe as well, but they were very influential. They were blue bloods of Boston society. So they began hosting tea parties, asking women to join and to boycott milliners that used birds in making headwear. Because you could walk down the streets of New York and you would see hats all the way down, whole birds on them, all feathers. The millinery wiped out 90% of the white egrets in Florida at this time. So it was really a travesty of what was going on. But these two women bonded together. Again, they created a group of women, a group of people, and eventually that's how the Massachusetts Audubon Society was born. eventually became across the country, and even the migratory bird treaty was also due to their work, where you couldn't transfer birds across state lines. So all of that from these two cousins. Because during this time, I was talking between the late 1800s, there were quite a few different milliners and hatters that were making different styles of hats. In the late 1800s, there was a play written for a stage actress named Sarah Bernhardt. In the play, she wore a soft felt styled hat, and her name in the play was Princess Fedora. So the fedora was first made and marketed for women, not men. It wasn't until around 1920 when a prince in England liked the style of a fedora and requested one be made in a more manly version. This is not from 1920. This is a Stetson style fedora, but just to show the difference between the soft felt versus something like this. In the 1920s, what happens in 1920? What was it? Roaring 20s. There you go. The Roaring 20s, the Roaring 20s. Women earn the right to vote. They begin to cut their hair short and put on a short type of hat called a cloche. And there's, of course, many different styles, colors, versions. But this is a style the women are wearing, while the men, of course, are wearing the fedoras. Now, the fedora was probably one of the most, and still one of the most popular hats for men today even. But during these times, there's a couple of milliners I do like to point out. These two hats are made by Elsa Schiaparelli. Now, Elsa Schiaparelli was Italian. Can you tell by my accent? Elsa was Italian. She opened a shop in Paris, and she was amazing. She wasn't just a milliner. She made clothing as well. She made the first style of culottes, which was a big no-no. I mean, people couldn't believe that a tennis pro wore a skirt to a tennis game, and that was due to Elsa. But she did a lot of work with different artists, in particular Salvador Dali. He designed with her what was called a high-heel shoe hat. It looked like an upside-down shoe up on atop your head. There's a couple in existence today. One's in a museum in London and one in New York. But that was Elsa's high-heel shoes hat. She also had a dress with a lobster painted on it by Dali. And she was the first one, if a woman wore a dress, instead of having a dress with a silver zipper, if it was a yellow dress, Elsa put in a yellow zipper. So she was very fashion forward. She made a pocketbook that looked like a dial of a telephone. So she had some very eccentric ideas, but a lot of the upper class, the artists and forward-thinking people loved her style. Now, when Germany declared war on France in 1941, Elsa came to the United States. She lived here with her husband, and they had a daughter. And over time, she did get divorced. She did move back to France after the war, and she opened her shop again. It wasn't quite as prolific as it had been. Her styles weren't as sought after. In the 50s, the styles headed more through Christian Dior, like a turban type of headwear. Yes, a church hat. But these were more of the 1950 styles. So in 1950, she did close her shop. But in 2012, the Schiaparelli name was brought back to the forefront of fashion. It was repurchased, and today is one of the top brands over in Europe and in England. Elsa, I mentioned, had a daughter. Her daughter had two daughters. One married Anthony Perkins from the Psycho movie. The other one was a photographer. She was vacationing down the Cape and was heading home to California when her plane hit the World Towers. So one of Elsa's granddaughters never saw her name brought back to the forefront. I mentioned that she closed her shop in 1950s. There was another milliner then who was still going strong in the 50s. He was actually born in Germany, but he had a shop in New York. His name was Mr. John. That was the name he used. Now, I like to mention Mr. John because I think he was a pretty colorful character. He had a woman come into his shop in New York, and she demanded a hat immediately. She said, I need something very special, but I need it right away. So Mr. John told her to sit. He literally built this hat atop her head while she waited. Well, when he was done, he told her the price, and she complained it was too much money. He said, just a minute. He literally disassembled the whole hat, handed her everything, and said, $3.59, you build it. So I thought that was a pretty funny. Now, in 1993, he passed away at the age of 91, and he was quoted as saying, I don't know what I'll do when I get to heaven because I don't think even I can improve on the halo. He was, by the way, considered the milliner to the stars. He designed the hats for Gone with the Wind, Greta Garbo, Vivian Leigh. Those were all his customers. So one more milliner I'm going to mention, and her name is Ann Dinkin. Ann Dinkin was a milliner for a hat shop in New York called Bonwit and Teller. So Bonwit and Teller is like our Macy's. Now, Ann would make some nice hats, but the reason I love this one is my mom got it at a yard sale. And it's a beautifully made hat, but what I love the most about it, it comes with a provenance. It comes with the brochure with all her hats pictured on it, with a note written by Ann Dinkin, because when World War II ended, Ann and her husband got two of the very few to get permission to move to Japan. So they were living in Japan, and the husband was actually selling transistor radios back to the States and making a fortune. Ann was still making her hats and selling them back to the States. So this one says on it, to pick the bonnet you like, my dear, and I will mail it to you. So this particular hat is checked off. And for $18.50 with shipping, that hat was sent. Just to give you an idea in today's prices, this is a Cha-Cha's House of Ill Repute. That's the brand name, one of my favorite milliners today. And this was about $450. The woman in the front row is telling me it matches her sweater. So I'm going to be checking her purse when she leaves. So Ann Dinkin, part of what I love about this is, again, the history and trying to find out information about these things. So my daughter was helping me trying to find information about Ann Dinkin, and all we could find was Jewish delicatessen owner. Come to find out, it's the same person. There's a little write-up here. When her and her husband were in Japan, they got divorced. Ann needed to make more money than what she was doing with the millinery. She opened Japan's one and only Jewish delicatessen. And talk about a smart woman, she got permission from the State Department there to be the sole importer of pastrami. She also said she taught all her employees to be rude to the customers. She said that way no one else could hire them away from me. So I thought she was a pretty colorful person. That's why I like to mention Ann. So this is all going on through the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and into the 60s. Now, in 1950, this is just a photo. Again, you're welcome to look afterwards if you'd like, but this is a photo of a group of school children in the 50s going to the circus, and they're all in hats. The kids, the parents. My mother's in this, so I can show it because she's not here today. And one of these, just as an example, this is, a little boy's hat from then. I mean, they're so cute. So this is through the 50s into the 60s. But now, in the 60s, the demise of headwear begins. A lot of that was credited, if I want to use the word credited, to our president, John Kennedy, Jack Kennedy. He was not a fan of headwear. There was even a book written, Hatless Jack. Now Kennedy did wear a top hat for his inauguration, but you really wouldn't see him wearing a hat after that. In fact, there are hat associations and hat groups. They were sending him hats on a daily basis, begging him to wear them. There was a meeting with the hat companies, and one of the gentlemen held up a photo of President Kennedy not wearing a hat, sailing on a boat, but no hat. And then he held up a picture of Gorbachev in Russia wearing the Russian hat. He said, how do we fix this? How do we change the attitudes in America? In fact, President Kennedy, when he was running, he stepped into a store one day on the trail, on the political trail, because he wasn't wearing a hat, and it started to rain. And it was such a big deal. The front page of the paper the next day said, Jack bought a hat. I mean, so a lot of people, unfortunately, credited that to the men's hats. Women started to tease their hair, color their hair in the 60s. This was now becoming their fashion statement. They felt hats were outdated at this point. In fact, some of the women up here were talking about wearing hats to church. So, rather lazy, but they started wearing these, what were called whimsies, just to have something on their head. See, they're all telling me they have some up here. And of course, Jackie Kennedy wore this style of hat. Now that was in the 60s. By the 70s, hat wear was almost non-existent for in the United States. They continue wearing hats over in Europe, but not so much here. But then, 1980s, there was a movie that came out in 1981, starring Harrison Ford. And what style hat was he wearing? A fedora. Well, what guy wouldn't want to look like Harrison Ford, right? So fedoras took off once again in popularity. And to this day, I mean, if you think of some of the musicians and actors, a lot of them do wear a nice hat. A lot of them wear fedoras or even a scally. And the women, also same time frame, 1981, Princess Diana. Princess Diana was a people's princess, they called her, and she loved her headwear. So she would wear a lot of beautiful hats. And that style always comes across the pond, if you will, to America. So in the 80s, women started wearing more fancy hats. If you think the TV shows at this time, too, there was Downton Abbey and Mad Men. They're all wearing hats. So they're back kind of in the forefront. I always tell people hats are a great conversation starter. When I was on a plane years ago, and I was in New Zealand, and the gentleman coming on the plane behind me had on a hat. And the first thing I noticed, all right, ladies, it wasn't the first thing I noticed, but one of the things I noticed was the Patriots hat. Of course, he had no idea who the New England Patriots were. He lived in New Zealand, but he got it on sale in England. But it was a great conversation starter. So I always say, go out and get a hat. But I am going to show you some of my favorite milliners today. My favorite milliner, Cha-Cha's House of Ill Repute. And this was a birthday gift. When I turned 60, my boyfriend took me to New York, and Cha-Cha and I designed this hat, which are my two favorite colors, purple and orange. And there's a little kiwi pin to represent the trip I took with my two kids. And this, she made it. I only helped design it. And then she also did this one. So Cha-Cha loves her top hats. I did have a hat I wore to the boathouse in New York years ago. They have a dinner, a headwear dinner for all the milliners all around the world. And I went just because I loved hats, and I'm wearing one of her hats. Now, I had never met her before. I didn't even know what she looked like. But this woman comes up to me so excited and says, "You're wearing my hat." And I'm like, "Oh, my God, it's Cha-Cha." So it was like such a cool thing. I had her sign the inside of it. And then this one is a Donna Davis. It's all metal. And it's little Swarovski crystals in it as well. Again, you guys are welcome to look, like the little kids, look with your eyes, but you're welcome to come up and look after. Yeah, your head would get wet if you wore this in the rain. Now, in the 1940s, they had these, they're legit hat boxes, but in miniature version. Here's another one, Dobbs. They're called salesman samples, but what they are actually are gift certificates. So you would present this to the person, and they would open it up, and inside is the hat that you have purchased them, and they would now take this to the shop and have a hat custom made. I wish they still did something like that today. It'd be a lot harder to lose this than a little gift card, right? This one's like a little cowboy style. Oh, speaking of the cowboy style, so in 1865, I quickly mentioned John Stetson invented the cowboy hat. He was from Philadelphia, but he had bad asthma, and he went out west, decided he would pan for gold, and he noticed the gentlemen were wearing either a straw hat or a bowler, so he came back east and designed this style hat. Of course, everyone in the East Coast made fun of him, but he took this out west, and it became known as the Boss of the Plains. One of his selling features, on the inside, it's hard to see unless you're up close, but it is a picture of a cowboy, and he's giving his horse water from a cowboy hat. So that was one of his selling features. Okay. All right, a few more here to show you. These are called college dinks. If anybody remembers the freshmen, this is just a photo. This is my alma mater, Stonehill College, but it shows a gentleman wearing one of these college dinks, a little beanie, and the freshmen had to wear them, and then the upper class could quiz them on things about the school. But of course, they attribute the demise to those when gentlemen were coming back from the war and they had the GI Bill. There was no way you were going to get them to wear one of those. And then, speaking of the war, this is one of my older hats too. This is German World War I. It's stamped 1915 Berlin. This is called a Pickelhaube. And this was infantry. If it were artillery, it would have the ball on top, not the spike. In 1916, because this wasn't the best hat for combat, the Germans recalled a lot of these, just cut off the top, and they would restamp the leather inside 1916, and then they reissued them. So this is one of the originals. I'm making my way around the table here. Okay. This is called a Chinese Mao. The girls, at a very young age, the Mao women, were taught this very intricate embroidery. So it's like a hat underneath, and it's embroidered with a lot of detail. And then it's all hand-hammered silver on top, predominantly birds and feathers. And they would wear these for weddings and festivals. Now this hat, I'd like to tell the story. When I was, I'll come on this side now, how's that? when I had had a couple of minor surgeries, but I was out of work for a little while, and two of my best friends wanted to cheer me up, so they said, let's go to the vineyard for the day. So we went to Martha's Vineyard, and I saw this hat in an antique window. And of course, I fell in love with it. But being my two best friends, they talked me out of spending the money on it. So I went home without it. It took a whole 3 days for me to convince my boyfriend to go to the vineyard. And yes, I got the hat. Now, fast forward about 10 years later, I'm walking the mail route in Mansfield, Mass., and a new shop opened up on my route. And over a few weeks, I was talking to the owner, Leaf. Her name is Leaf Boutique. And she was talking, we were talking about hats, and I said, I had a favorite hat. It was a Chinese Mao. And she said to me, I know where you got that. I said, how can you possibly know that? It was her mother's store on the vineyard in Edgartown. Talk about a small world, right? Okay. My daughter had gone to Spain years ago, and I said, the only thing I want, the Spanish and the Portuguese wear this style of hat with their festival costumes and such. Matador hat, very good. So I asked her, I said, I don't want a toy one, I want an authentic one. She searched high and low. She said, Mom, I could not find one. About a year later, I'm in an antique store in Maine, and I find one. And I brought it home, and my mother, by the way, is 86, works full time. But she looked at this and said, well, why did you buy Mickey Mouse ears? My brother's laughing at that one. My kids, a few years ago, I'd always wanted a hat. As a company, I put it in a hat box, in a cake box, but there's a company in Japan. And it's called Kent Bread. And they make hats that look like cookies, pancakes, cakes. And I really wanted one of these, but they don't ship to the United States. So for Mother's Day, a few years ago, my son, who's very good on the computer, managed to find the hat I wanted from this gentleman that makes them. And then he had it shipped to a shipping company in Japan, and then had it shipped to me. So it was a really awesome Mother's Day. Okay, this was in the movie Jewel of the Nile. When I bring this one up, I talk about the hat that got away, because way back when I was probably in my 20s, I could afford this one. But at Universal Studios, by the way, they used to sell the props. So I bought this hat. But the one I really wanted at the time was $1,000, was Mary Poppins' original hat. I know, I wish I could have afforded it then. This is actually rather heavy. This is what the Las Vegas showgirls wear. So it's very intricately beaded. It's a really pretty hat. Thank you. All right. I was in Brimfield a couple years ago, a couple of friends, and I saw this. Now, this is very unique because it's Amish bonnets. But when the infant is born, they wear a white bonnet. And then as they age, it's like the Russian nesting dolls. And her name, Amanda, is in the last hat. And when they get married, they go back to wearing a white hat. But I saw these in a booth, and I was like, wow, I've never seen a full set of these before. So there was a gentleman there, and I asked him, rather nonchalantly, oh, what are these, bonnets? He says, yeah, my wife got those. Who'd want bonnets? My answer was, oh, goody. I think he probably got in trouble when she got back to the booth. This is also from the 1800s. This is Iroquois Indian, and it's all hand beaded. They would actually sell these to the tourists up around Niagara Falls. Okay, when Robert Kraft built the new stadium for the Patriots, if we have any Patriots fans out there, before they built the stadium, they were supposed to move to St. Louis and become the Stallions. Of course, they never moved. They do have a Stallion shirt at Patriots Place, but they don't have a hat. These were supposed to be destroyed, so I'm holding out for season tickets for this one. Hopefully we have a shot this year. All right, and talk about making hats that were supposed to be destroyed. 10, 20, 30, 37, Super Bowl 37. So the Buccaneers played the Raiders. They both say Super Bowl 37 on them. Well, one has the Raiders on it, and one has the Buccaneers. Anybody know who won? There you go. And who was their coach? The Raiders had fired their coach, and guess who picked them up? The Buccaneers. And guess who beat the Raiders in the Super Bowl? The Buccaneers. But back to the hats. Obviously, the Raiders one was supposed to be destroyed, but here they are, which I thought was kind of cool. Okay, this one. It's molting, but it's from Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus. A friend of mine actually was the caretaker for a gentleman that worked for the circus. He passed away. He was in his 90s, this gentleman, and he had a lot of paraphernalia. And he gave my friend some items, and my friend gave me this hat. And on the inside, it has the name of a company. When I checked the history of the company, they made hats for the circus as well as for different performances in New York. And then it had the woman's name. So I checked her name against performances, against the circus. Come to find out, her last name is Hunt. And her twin sister did acrobats in the 40s for Ringling Brothers. And there's just a photo of the two. It's a very small picture, sorry, but it's a picture of the two sisters holding a hat similar to that one. Okay. Oh, fascinators. When Prince Harry got married, by the way, his invitations stipulated all the women must wear a hat or a fascinator to the wedding. So this is an example of a fascinator. Sometimes they're hair clips, or sometimes it's like a barrette type style like this. And then, let's see, one more fascinator to show you. This is a Mary Galvin out of Boston. She just moved to New Hampshire, but I love this one. So yeah, it's wire and obviously fake flowers, but it's just such a beautiful hat. Fascinator. Now, time. Am I running low here? All right, 5 minutes to go, guys. So, one last story, and yeah, one last big story. I saved this for the last. This was a gift from my dad. My parents always supported my hat habit. So my dad was in Bermuda many, many years ago. And, times were different then, of course. But my dad went up to a Bermuda policeman, and he asked him, "Where did you get your hat?" And the policeman said, let's say, Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith issues them to us. And my dad said, "Well, where would I find him?" And the policeman said, "Well, Mr. Smith works out of the armory." So my father hailed a cab, and he asked the cabbie to take him to the armory. And the cabbie said, "Oh, I can't do that. That's off limits. We're not allowed there." So my father asked him, "Well, how far can you get me?" And cabbie said, "I can get you to the gate." So my dad got in the cab. The cabbie took him to the gate of the armory. Well, as they were pulling up, the guard came out with his submachine gun over his shoulder, and here's my father in the back seat rolling down the window, and the cabbie says, "What can I do for you?" And my father says, "I'm Joseph Muratori from the United States of America. I'm here to see Mr. Smith." Oh, okay. Well, they waved them in. So the cabbie says, I'm not supposed to be in here. My father says, what are you worried about? He waved us in. So they came up to a second gate, pretty much the same situation. The gentleman came out with a machine gun on. My father said, I'm here to see Mr. Smith. I'm from the United States. Okay, and waved him in a second time. So the cabbie, my dad telling the story, said the cabbie, I could see the sweat beating up on the back of his neck. And they come to the base of the armory. And my dad says to the cab driver, just wait for me. I'll make it worth your while. I'll be back. So Dad up the stairs into the building. He tells the secretary, Mr. Muratori, I'm here to see Mr. Smith. Have a seat. I'll tell him you're here. She comes out a few minutes later. Mr. Smith will see you now. So Dad goes in, and Mr. Smith says, well, what can I do for you? You know, they exchange pleasantries, and, well, what can I do for you, Mr. Muratori? Well, I want to get my daughter a police hat. Well, Mr. Smith looked at him. He said, how did you get in here? My father says, they waved us in at the gate. So Mr. Smith replied, for the sheer fact that you were able to get in here to me today, I am going to get you a Bermuda police hat. I can't just hand it to you, but give me your flight information, and I will have a custom slip waiting for you with a police hat. My dad, not being pushy, with a badge and everything. And Mr. Smith said, yes, with a badge and everything. So Dad replied, oh, thank you so much. That's great. And what can I do for you? And Mr. Smith replied, Mr. Muratori, you've done more than enough. You taught me I need to upgrade my security system. So that's it, guys. And I like to, one last warning. I say everyone looks great in a hat. Go buy one, but do it when you're sober. Or you might think you look good in one of these. Thank you, everybody. Yes.
What kind of feathers are in those hats?
That's predominantly ostrich, which is legal, and as is peacock. Other feathers are not legal unless you're a Native American.
And also, are you aware, the reason why I asked, because I have recently been made aware of the fact that gentlemen that wear bow ties, they're wearing bow ties made out of peacock.
Peacock illegal. See, I named that one. I'm impressed. Yes.
Where do you store all these hats?
My adult son says, Mom, if one more thing comes into this house, and I just tell them, you are so screwed when I die. But they're all downstairs. They're on the walls, literally hooked on the drop ceilings. They're on the walls. They're on hat racks that hold like 40 hats each. And yeah, there's a little passage through the room. Yes, son.
So, what did you study in college, and how did you learn about it? Obviously, you...
I actually studied marketing management, and I was petrified to do public speaking, but they made us do it. And when I graduated, I was a sales rep for 10 years. And then I delivered a mail route for 27 years and retired last year. But throughout that, I've always loved hats, and I loved history.
And you looked into the history?
Yes, that's part of what I like, is looking up the history.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
You don't have a Busby, do you?
A which one?
A Busby.
A Busby.
Yeah, the palace, you know. And
Oh, I do, because when I was in high school, I was in the marching band. So we have the tall hats like that with the plume in the front. So I can get away with saying that's what it is. Yes. Well, thank you very much, everybody.